Right now, I'm going to hand this over to Tara Sattler, who is our Director of Client Solutions. Tara?
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you all to our quarterly Community of Practice webinar entitled From Resident to Physician Leader, Exploring a New Approach to Self-Awareness and Development. Next slide, please. As you can see, we are a small but fierce core team of 5 women located in the greater New York City and Boston areas. On that note, I'm thrilled to mention that we were just granted certification as a women's business enterprise by the Women Presidents Educational Organization under the extraordinary leadership of our President and CEO, Tracy Duberman. Next slide. TLD Group is a global management consulting firm that focuses exclusively on developing leaders in healthcare organizations who inspire change and can execute business strategies. Next slide, please. We deliver impactful leadership development solutions to healthcare organizations of all types, including providers, which is our academic medical centers, integrated delivery systems, regional and community hospitals, and large group practices, pharmaceuticals, including manufacturers, biotech, and medical device organizations, and payers, insurance companies, and managed care organizations. Our cadre of experienced academicians, executive and physician coaches, and organizational development consultants have multi-year experience working within the healthcare industry. Next slide. We bring talent development solutions to senior executives, medical and scientific leaders, teams, and boards within the provider, pharmaceutical, and payer sectors. Next slide. Our solutions include executive and physician leadership assessment and coaching, organizational development consulting, group leadership development programs, including our coveted Applied Physician Leadership Academy and Applied Partnership Leadership Academy, our APLA programs, and a speakers bureau. Our solutions are designed to engage and empower leaders to take on the challenges facing the industry and develop the capabilities to execute business strategies that position their organizations for success. Next slide. So please be sure to follow us on social media to stay connected and up to date. Next slide. The goal of TLD Group's Community of Practice is to gather coaching and consulting professionals from around the globe in an effort to learn from each other, deepen knowledge, and raise the level of collective expertise on leadership development in healthcare. We have a Community of Practice group on LinkedIn dedicated to this very purpose. And so if you are not already a member, please be sure to join us. Next slide. Today's webinar, From Resident to Physician Leader, Exploring a New Approach to Self-Awareness and Development, is designed exclusively for and by members of our Community of Practice. As such, it brings me great pleasure to introduce you to our 2 Community of Practice presenters, Alan Friedman and Michelle Rigolizzo of J3P. Next slide. Alan is a global healthcare executive with broad experience working with C-suite level leaders, teams, and organizations. He is the founder and CEO of J3P, which is a mission-driven, research-based organization that fosters innovation for the world's best healthcare organizations by providing the evidence-based tools necessary to bring about transformation in today's uncertain environment. Alan received his master's in organizational psychology, change leadership from Columbia University, certificates in management practices from New York University and in finance from McGill University, and completed the Launching New Ventures program at Harvard Business School. Next slide, please. Michelle is the Chief Learning Strategist at J3P, as well as an adult learning researcher at Harvard Business School. She is an expert in designing learning and development initiatives from start through to evaluation, combining the needs of the individual learner with organizational strategy. Michelle works with senior management to set strategic direction for creating a continuous learning environment to improve individual and organizational performance and processes. Michelle received her Master's in Education in Human Development and Psychology, Neuroscience, Cognitive Science, and Adult Education from Harvard University Graduate School of Education. And she is currently working towards her doctorate in Organizational Behavior Studies Management at Harvard Business School. And now, with great delight and anticipation, I hand the mic over to Alan.
Thank you very much, Tara. Appreciate the very kind introduction. In terms of the background and our agenda, in terms of what we're going to be discussing today, we're going to be really discussing the foundation for why we're engaged in this work, from the foundational levels of the medical student and bringing it all the way forward to really what we have found to be required for the quote-unquote successful physician leader of today. We want to discuss our research relating to orthopedic surgical residents that we conducted a few years ago nationally. Also, really present and highlight strategies that we found to be productive relating to using objectively based tools for this population, and then ultimately really have Michelle explain what are some of the future implications for this type of work from an assessment perspective, and then open it up for questions. So the first question is, what is this name J3P and what does it really stand for? I'm not going to spend a tremendous time on our background, but it is germane that the J to the third power stands for my daughter who has special needs, Jules, which is one of the reasons why we started our organization. Joseph Zuckerman is the Surgeon-in-Chief and Chairman of Orthopedic Surgery at NYU's Hospital for Joint Diseases, and the third J is for Joyce Hogan, who many of you on the call may know the Hogan Assessment. She co-founded the Hogan Assessment organization with Robert Hogan, or Bob Hogan, but that's not why she's included in our name. It's because she passed away from a medical mistake at a large medical institution in Florida. So we really are a mission-driven organization and want to use data to really approach this type of work. Here are some of our partnerships. Here's our uncompensated advisory board. These people are much smarter than I am, but you'll notice that there's people who are physicians, there's people who are organizational psychologists, and there are also people who are attorneys. We want to make sure that we have expertise in the areas that we don't, to make sure that we're making good, informed decisions so that we can develop the appropriate tools and assessments that are necessary for the field. And in terms of our work, we believe that everything that we do has to end up in some kind of a manuscript or a poster or a symposia being presented to a peer-reviewed audience. And that's really been the foundation for how we've done our work over the last few years. So this is just a short reference list of that work. And then obviously here are some of the recent events that we've been involved with. To be clear, our focus is really on the assessment, not necessarily the facilitation and the coaching. That's what all of you professionals are engaged in. So when we think about our approach to this work, it's really very similar to how medical students and other clinical students are trained, which broadly stated is taking data, incorporating it with other criteria to impact a positive change or an outcome. And so when we think about the use of assessments in coaching specifically for physicians, if there's objectively based instruments that we can incorporate into that practice, then theoretically speaking, we'll have more credibility and we'll be able to have more impact on that type of work. So why does this matter, and why are we approaching the work in the way that we are? When we think about the guidelines and the regulations that are really facing the healthcare system and the medical education system at all levels, it really starts at the medical education level or medical student level. And these are an example of the physician competencies that are now being required in terms of curriculum by the AAMC, the American Association of Medical Colleges, which really oversees medical schools in Canada and the United States. And so when we see here, out of these 8, that the ones highlighted in red really impact the work that we do. It's about self-awareness, it's about emotional intelligence, it's about understanding personality, behavior, how people interact with other people, etc. So this is really being enculturated into the very foundation of the curriculum at the medical education level. And then when we think about things at the graduate medical education level, which is really when we think about residents, or even fellows for that matter, there are these 6 milestones, which are requirements that are mandated by all residents that are accredited under the ACGME. And these are different for each specialty in terms of the specifics, but the broad domains are applicable for all of the specialties. And again, we see here that 3 of these are impacted by those same type of skills. So the reality is that there's a lot of work that's been done relating to assessments, whether it be personality assessments, behavioral assessments, 360 or multi-rater. Work relevant to them in a way that can be understood. And a big mistake that I think that our field has made in the past is we've put a stethoscope on the cover of a report and said, oh, it's for healthcare now. And through our work, we realized that based upon all the changes that were happening at the medical education level and graduate medical education level, leading into the changes that are happening at the healthcare system broadly stated, that we needed to be thinking more about this in terms of an evidence-based approach and publishing in the way that the healthcare system or the medical education system would respect in terms of our academic rigor. So all the things that are listed on this slide are not a surprise to anyone on this call, but obviously there are a lot of changes occurring very rapidly and that are impacting everything from physician burnout to administrative requirements to revenue production, etc. And the idea is that many of the physicians that we've interacted with, they do not have the skills to really understand how to pivot between the clinical environment where they have tremendous expertise and really the administrative environment where they have to excel or else they're not going to be successful in the new environment. So what we want to do is we want to really recognize these things and provide tools to people like yourselves to be able to present to the people and your clients that you work with in order to make sure that what you're doing at least is an intermediary of relevance to what they may have experienced in the past. And then obviously when we think about selecting people and developing people and promoting people within healthcare, and this is really about allied health professionals, nurses, students, etc., physician assistants, nurse extenders, or physician extenders, I'm sorry. The reality is that there are a lot of things that this community is being faced with. And unfortunately, when we think about our type of work, oftentimes it's minimized. What we're trying to do as an organization is approach this in a way that will at least mitigate that minimization and provide tools for people like yourselves to really be able to approach this in a way that is differentiated, quite frankly, than a lot of other people who are engaged in this work. So where we were previously is here. If you were good at what you did, you were a great surgeon, you were a great clinician, you published a lot, well, that was fine. You could do very well in your career. Well, where we are today is you got to be a good fit and there's a real team focus. And then obviously when we're thinking about where things are going into the future with this concept of empathy or patient satisfaction, outcomes, value-based care, systems thinking, all of these different things really require physicians and all of the employees within the healthcare system to think differently than they have been trained previous. And what we believe is that if we can provide the right tools and put it in the hands of professionals like yourselves, that at least we're going to help change the culture of what is happening in healthcare and make people more self-aware, which, as we remember from the J3P mission slide, that's really why we started. So when we think about the skills that are necessary, and this slide came from some work that Peter Angood had done, who's the president and CEO of the AAPL, the idea that the skills that are really required for someone to be successful in the operating room versus the skills that are actually required for someone to lead an administrative team are often very different. So the people on this call understand what it takes to actually coach people through different behaviors and reactions to certain things that may be happening within their environments. What we believe is that we have to start with assessment, and not necessarily assessment for selection, but assessment for awareness. And the reason why is, as we mentioned earlier from how we approach this work on that slide, the idea is we have to provide the data for these people to really understand how to change the behavioral output if they need to change it, if it's damaging his or her reputation or ability to interact with others, or amplify the things that make that person great. So that's really an important differential. And then when we think about this work just conceptually, we have to provide that data at the intrapersonal level within the oneself or within that individual in order for him or her to understand the intersection between his or her own personality, subsequent behaviors, and how he or she interacts and relates to other people interpersonally, which ultimately will interact and intersect with that person's ability to lead other people systemically or on behalf of an organization. And obviously, as everyone on the call knows here, if you know yourself, you're going to obviously be a much better leader. So when we set out on this work back in 2012, we really set out to really understand what the characteristics and personality traits of a successful orthopedic resident were. And so what we did was we partnered with the Hogan Assessment Organization, and we recruited 12 nationally ranked orthopedic surgical residency programs from around the United States and studied what we thought were going to be predictive in terms of the criteria for a successful orthopedic surgical resident. And so we started with conducting a job analysis using a survey platform that we've customized, and we collected 174 faculty or subject matter expert surveys, which provided input into what they thought were the important characteristics of someone to be successful in the role of an orthopedic surgical resident. And then what we did was we went to the approximately 300 residents or incumbents within those same 12 programs and had them complete the Hogan assessment, all three assessments, the HPI, Hogan Personality Inventory, the HDS, the Hogan Development Survey, and the MVPI, the Motives, Values, Preferences Inventory. And we had a decent compliance, 297 of 303 who completed it. And this data was collected over about a 2-month period in the fall of 2013. So once we collected all of that data, what we then did was we went back to the same faculty who helped us complete this job evaluation tool survey, and we said, we want you to provide behavioral observation data to us based upon your incumbents or residents that you oversee and you help train and mentor. And so from that process, we ended up with 280 performance evaluation surveys completed. And obviously we removed some because they didn't complete all three of the assessments. From that process of the 280, 100 faculty across those 12 programs actually gave us behavioral data that was linked to those residents. And so after we had it broken down into the 280, we had to remove another 14 of those residents because of extreme data and other variables that would have impacted the data set. And we ended up with an evaluation of 266 residents that went through and completed the Hogan assessment and then also had performance evaluations or behavioral evaluations completed by their faculty who supervised them on a daily basis. So what we found, and a lot of this was really intuitive, but we at least were able to provide an objectively based concrete data point to the work. And what we found relating to the high-performing resident characteristics was that a high-performing orthopedic resident will remain calm under stress and pressure. So if we think about the Hogan assessment and we think about the adjustment scale as a part of the HPI, that's directly relating to the scoring ranges on the adjustment scale within the HPI. Someone who's procedurally driven and rules compliant would be linked to prudence, etc. Sensitive to and perceptive of patient needs and stays current with clinical trends and technology. And so that would be linked to the HPI. What we then found in terms of the stress tendencies, which is linked to the HDS, was that people who were low-performing residents really overreacted to stressful situations or lost their temper. That would be linked to excitability. prone to fault-finding and sensitive to criticism, overly self-confident, impulsive, and make impractical or unpredictable decisions. So if you think about this logically, these are things that obviously we don't want in someone who's going to be operating on us. And then when we look at the data that was associated with the MVPI, we have a strong desire to help other people. That would be linked to altruism. A desire for structure and minimizing risk. That would be linked to tradition and appreciation and respect for standards, and values relationships more than profitability. So these were the things that we found based upon our research. And then really what this ended up in was a profile of a quote-unquote successful orthopedic surgical resident, with someone who remains calm under pressure, is perceptive, really is interested in learning new techniques, is really detail-oriented and conscientious, is trusting and not inherently skeptical, is practical in terms of how they approach their work, is outcome-oriented, and obviously is known for a strong work ethic. And when we look at the critical competencies that are necessary for someone to be successful based upon the data that we had collected across these programs, what we see is that these are the things that are absolutely necessary behaviorally for someone to exhibit to be successful based upon the data that we collected from across these programs. And if we look at persuasive ability and we think about that in the context of the corporate world, that would really be known as sales ability. So for those of you who are familiar with using the Hogan assessment and some of the language, what we've done is really customized a lot of the work that the Hogan organization has already done and really made it relevant specifically for this population. So these are the things that are absolutely required in terms of competencies. And then when we look at the conclusion in terms of what does it mean down to brass tacks relating to selection, the idea here is that when we look at the profile that we created, and we started with 28 scales within the Hogan vernacular, and we ended up with 9 scales. And based on those 9 scales that were shown to be predictive of a successful orthopedic surgical resident, we know that by using this profile, more than the orthopedic residents who met this profile were more than twice as likely to be rated by the faculty members as a strong overall performer, going back to that slide where we had the actual behavioral observation or performance evaluations that collected from those faculty at all of those programs. We also found that they were more than twice as likely to receive a favorable rating on those same metrics in terms of their interactions with staff, patients, and other colleagues, and they were nearly twice as likely to receive high ratings on surgical skills. So we were able to really come up with these conclusions. These data are actually being finalized in a manuscript now that is most likely going to be submitted to the Journal for Bone and Joint Surgery. And as you can imagine, getting 12 orthopedic surgeons, actually more than that, it's probably about 16 orthopedic surgeons from around the United States to collaborate on a manuscript is a Herculean task, but we're trying to kind of rein in the cat, so to speak. So hopefully that'll be submitted and accepted within the near future. So this is the work that got us started in terms of selection and provided a nice foundation in terms of what we know is necessary for someone to be a successful resident. And so that got us thinking that, well, what do we have now from a development perspective that we can offer to both the medical students as well as the residents and the faculty within these educational training programs? So what we decided to do was partnered with other organizations to develop different tools that were based upon, in some cases, validated assessments. In other cases, we were creating them from scratch to really provide tools and resources that are cost-effective, that don't require a certification to actually utilize, and can really be exposed to a much larger audience than if we think about the traditional way that a lot of these assessments are used. It's high cost, it's a lot of one-on-one coaching, which is obviously very important for what we all do, but at the end of the day, if we can actually provide tools and allow you as practitioners in this field to broaden the scope of the work that you're doing, maybe one step below the executive suite, and enculturate the concept of self-awareness and strategies for emotional intelligence to maybe 30 people at once versus one person for the same cost level, you now have a different business that you can get into, and you can also expand the value proposition for your clients. So when we think about the tools that I'm referring to, as I referenced on one of the earlier slides, we have partnerships with two organizations that are really relevant for this population. The first is with the American Medical Student Association, and this is the largest student-run organization for medical students in the world. And what we then did was we partnered with Aon Hewitt, who many of you may know for some of the other work that they do, but they actually have a validated assessment called ADEPT 15. So what we did was we actually took ADEPT 15, and then we took their report, which originally was about 20 pages, and we pared it down to about 9 pages and made the language and the scale names relevant for this audience. And so we literally just launched this report at the AMSA fall meeting in San Juan a couple of weeks ago. But the idea behind this is to provide tools and resources for medical students to be able to increase their level of self-awareness prior to entering into residency. So this partnership is meaningful in a couple of ways with our relationship with AMSA as well as our relationship with Aon. But this is what the Arnold P. Gold Foundation is or does. They helped create the white coat ceremony that is used at most, if not all, of the medical schools in the United States and Canada. And their whole mission is to insert humanism into the caregiver paradigm. So they're very focused on increasing self-awareness and making sure that medical students, upon graduation, are just as empathic behaviorally as they are when they start medical school. And obviously the literature shows that as medical students progress through medical school, they actually lose their empathic behavior. And so what we want to do is create some more self-awareness relating to that to get out ahead of that, so that by the time those medical students enter residency, at least we have a fighting chance because they've at least been exposed to some self-awareness through assessment. And this is what that report looks like here. And so what you'll notice within the Gold Humanism Assessment Tool is that it's linked to something called the IE Cares model. And one of the IE Cares attributes is obviously empathy. But what we've done is we've actually created contextual vignettes within the report. And within the report, we have areas of risk based upon your individual scores. So depending upon how an individual scores, depending upon the norm, will depend on what language populates here in terms of suggestions, in terms of how he or she will react to this contextual vignette. And this assessment, we just launched our pilot study with 9 medical schools, 1 osteopathic medical school, 6 allopathic medical schools, and 2 nursing schools around the United States under IRB approval. So we just launched our pilot study a couple of weeks ago, and we're actively collecting data to make sure that we actually have a face-valid tool, and we're hoping to have this available to the community, I would say, probably by February of 2017. If it was up to me, we would have it yesterday, but I'm an unreasonable person. So that's what we have and what we've developed thus far for the medical student level at the medical education level. Again, 2 different types of assessments. One's more behavioral, one's more personality-based, through 2 different partnerships. But the idea behind this is that you don't necessarily have to have a certification to actually receive a report and read it and understand what it means. So where we started, as I mentioned, relating to our work with Hogan was really around selection. And what we found was as we were engaged to work with all of these residency programs within orthopedic surgery and neurosurgery and pediatrics and other specialties, there was a desire to really have tools that related to helping develop the medical students who matched to these residency programs. So what we realized was that there was an opportunity for us to take the same data that we were collecting as it relates to selection and really customize and develop development reports based upon the same data that we were collecting for selection purposes, which provided the foundation for the professional practice guide, which is the name of the report at the faculty level. And then we have a report that mirrors this called the Transition to Practice Guide. and that is for the resident level. And it's the same report. One is written more for the trainee, one is written more for the practicing or attending physician level. So this report is 9 pages, and as you can see here, this is linked to the HPI, one of the Hogan assessments, and you'll notice that there's an area that outlines what this person's strengths are, what this person's challenges are, and it also offers suggestions for that individual in terms of how he or she can mitigate or amplify his or her own behavior. And then there's a section here for reflective feedback and action items. So the idea here, again, is not to make coaches obsolete, but to really take an assessment-based methodology, put it into the hands of trained coaches, trained professionals, trained consultants, trained practitioners, to really expand the concept of this work to more broader audiences versus the one-on-one or at the executive team level. And then we also have just a sample here of what interpersonal sensitivity would look like. So the idea is this is a report that's developed either for the faculty or for the resident, and it is really a self-coaching report that someone can choose to use or not use, but it gives them the opportunity to actually go through some exercises for themselves. What we also received feedback on as we continued on this work with our clients and our collaborators was that the program directors, the chairpersons of these departments, the designated institutional officials, the heads of GME offices, wanted to know, was there a type of report that we could develop that could actually help the people responsible for training these residents and fellows to help manage their development. So we then took that as a foundation, and we developed a report called the Mentor Guide, which is based upon the same data that we collect from the other assessments. And we can now run a report that is written for the supervisor, the mentor, the program director, etc., developmentally for the people that are responsible for training. So how this would be used in practical terms is the medical student, or in this case the resident, would actually receive, go back here, the professional practice guide or the transition to practice guide, and the program director or the chair or whoever the person responsible for mentoring the other individual would receive the mentor guide. And this report, as we can see here, actually offers suggestions and feedback in terms of how to best manage, mentor, and develop his or her subordinate, his or her mentee. And so at the medical education, graduate medical education level, we provide these resources to the program leadership as a part of the developmental process for the resident. I will tell you that at the faculty level or the attending level, what we typically do is we provide the professional practice guide and we provide the mentor guide to the focal physician attending or faculty member, and allow that person to then have the choice if they want to share that mentor guide with his or her mentor or with his or her supervisor. Obviously, the context is a little different, so that's how we've chosen to roll these out. What we've also done is we've created different data reports that can outline the specific data points for the individual completing the assessment. So the HPI data report, or what we call the usual tendencies, outlines how someone is wired to act under normal or typical circumstances, and this is really the HPI scales from within the Hogan suite. When we look at stress tendencies, we have the 11 scales here that are related to the Hogan Development Survey. And what's really interesting about the data report for stress tendencies is that we're in the process right now of developing a report similar to the professional practice guide or the transitional practice guide or the mentor guide that is based upon the HDS relating to resiliency and stress tendencies, just like this report is actually based upon the HPI, as you can see from the yellow graphical information here. So we're in the process of developing a report that will specifically be based upon these stress tendencies for this population as well. And we're hoping to have that completed probably Q2 of 2017. And then finally, in relationship to the Hogan, we've really related a report that gets to the drivers, to the things that are important based upon the MVPI, motives, values, preferences, inventory. And what we see here is these are the things that motivate the individual. So if we look at providing the HPI data, how someone wakes up in the morning, so to speak, how they're wired, and we look at how that person is going to be wired to act under stressful tendencies, the higher their scores here, the higher the dosage of that type of behavior that he or she has a tendency to exhibit. And then we tie it all together with the behavioral, the value piece. We can actually understand how to redirect certain behavior from a personality perspective if we understand what that person values and holds important. So in the long run, probably in about a year, year and a half, we'll be developing a professional practice guide or a transition practice guide along with a mentor guide relating to the MVPI data as well. But that's more into the future. So when we think about the reports that we've been working with and the research that we've conducted at the medical education level and the graduate medical education level and the interaction that we've had at the chair level and heads of graduate medical education departments at a variety of institutions and medical centers, what we really found was that there was a paucity of really good, reliable, valid tools that were specifically designed by and for the physician leadership population. And so what that led us to the realization of is that we needed to develop something that actually catered to that very specific population of expert. And so what we did was we ended up partnering with our collaborators at Columbia University, and this process started about 2.5 years ago. About 2 years ago, we started actually developing what the actual assessment would look like. About 1.5 years ago, we interviewed a variety of subject matter experts, and we came up with a construct and an assessment process that we piloted at 19 different institutions under IRB approval last summer, so the summer of 2015. And about 65% of the items that were contained within that assessment held up. And we're in the process now of conducting a formal validation study for the assessment that has been built and the work that's been done from last August through this past August. And so when we think about where we started in terms of the development of this process, as I mentioned, we interviewed 25 quote-unquote high-performing, existing high-level physician leaders. And these people were the presidents and CEOs of very large, well-known healthcare systems. These people were on the boards of the New England Journal of Medicine, the ACGME, the ACGME, AAMC, the alphabet soup of all the different societies. And what we really wanted to do was find out from people who are in positions of leadership and prominence in today's terms what he or she thought was important and what he or she thought was not important. So this is what we did in advance of actually piloting the assessment process. We piloted the assessment process, as I mentioned, and we're in the process of collecting data to get us to an N of 100 to validate the actual physician leader assessment that we're developing. And so when we think about the information that we were able to glean from these subject matter expert interviews, and again, for those of you who are on the call, this is fairly obvious, we know this, but what we were able to do is we were able to actually get this data qualitatively from all of the people that we interviewed, and these were the things that really held up in terms of the high-performing physician leaders do this, the low-performing physician leaders do this. So the idea of the work that we're engaged in is not necessarily we're reinventing the wheel, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to do this work in a way that is specifically relevant for this audience, not just because we want to reinvent the wheel, but because there is a contextual difference between physician leadership and traditional leadership, and what we want to do is we want to bridge that gap. So to that end, what we're in the process of doing now is working off of this conceptual model, which is really, I'm sorry about that, which is really talking about wellness outcomes. And so when we think about this, the head is really the cognitive ability. Does someone have the skills to do the work? The heart is really the engine in terms of that drives the work that's going to get done. And then the hands are really what behavior is manifested. And so the idea is that if we can actually understand these things better than we do in today's terms, then we're really going to be able to drive wellness outcomes in quotes. And that really encompasses wellness for our patients, wellness for our staff, and then obviously what's very important to today's terms is really institutional wellness, and that refers to a myriad of different metrics that are attached to the ACA, Affordable Care Act, as well as other items that are currently facing the healthcare system. And so looked at differently from more of the physician leader level, the idea here is that we have the head, the heart, and the hands. EPL is executive physician leader. And so the idea is if we have someone who is well balanced, who understands his or her own personality and subsequent behaviors and can actually manage his or her energy, then theoretically speaking, that is going to carry down to the staff, ultimately directly for the physician if they're still seeing patients, and then obviously indirectly through changing the culture of the organization through staff well-being, and then obviously those outcomes will flow through in that direction. So when we think about where we've come as an organization in terms of the research that we've conducted, medical education, graduate medical education, and now we're working at the physician leader level within the healthcare system, one of the things that as an organization we're thinking about is what is the potential for the future in terms of thinking differently about how people learn, about how people behave, and that's really one of the reasons why we had partnered with Michelle, who's going to really speak about different ways to look at learning behaviors and really what type of implication that thought process may have on the future of our work and potentially assessments that are being developed. Michelle?
Hello. Thank you, Alan. That was really interesting to see. Alan gave us a really comprehensive overview of assessments that can position this population for success. And what I'd like to talk about is, now that we think about raising self-awareness and we've assessed our population, the people that we're coaching, and we have to actually develop them. They have to actually then start learning, and in this case, moving from a resident to physician leader, what are the behaviors that are going to enable them to learn and to learn systematically, and what is the relationship between their personality and those behaviors? Next slide, please. So, if we think about it, personality is the tendency to engage in a given behavior. And so it really is, personality can inform what a person may or may not be likely to do. And as coaches, especially of this population or of really any lifelong learners, it's important to understand how individuals differ in their approach to learning, differ in what behaviors they're likely to engage in or not. And what attracts them, what do they resist? And the work that I've done reveals that there are individual differences in learners' preferences for engaging in certain learning behaviors. So, and this shows that people might be getting in the way of their own learning, might be sabotaging their own learning because they like doing some of these learning behaviors based on sort of their personality preferences and what energizes them, and they might avoid or dislike doing others. And so I really want you to come away from this thinking of, three things. One is to really conceptualize learning as behavior. Very often we think about learning as outcome, and that gets us into a short-term view of learning. But really what we've seen is that there are certain behaviors that really increase the likelihood of much longer-term, deeper learning. Two, that individuals have preferences for engaging in some behaviors and not others. And this could be problematic because we need all of them to really learn in the long term. And that there may be systematic differences based on the role. So whether they're a leader, whether they're a resident, whether they're drawn to the medical field, whether they're drawn to a given field, may directly impact which behaviors they likely engage in. And finally, the third thing I'd really like you to take away is that awareness of these behaviors, both as coaches and as the actual learner, is really going to increase learning outcomes. It's going to set learners up for success. Next slide, please. So I've been talking a lot about, learning and these learning behaviors, but I'd really like to start by defining individual learning. And I think cognitive science provides us a really clarifying definition of individual learning, because there's a lot of debate. Is it behavior? Is it attitude? But really we found that individual learning occurs when there's a change in long-term memory. And really this is based on the assumption that once knowledge and skills are embedded in long-term memory, they are learned. They are available to the learner, they can be applied, they can be assessed, and so really individual learning is about contributing to changing long-term memory. Next slide. And so what we've also found is that there are certain behaviors that really contribute to changing long-term memory. And these behaviors are really what I'm calling learning behaviors. And so to illustrate them, you can see there's 5 of them. Taking on a challenge, attending to information, building meaningful context, repeated practice, and reflection. And this is not new. This is well established in the literature. But I really still want to walk you through how this might look from taking a physician moving into a leadership role. First, the physician has to view this move as a trigger for learning. They have to say, there's something there I have to learn. I don't already know how to do this. And that's really in that taking on a challenge. And this is a considerable hurdle in and of itself, particularly with this population. However, if our physician takes on the challenge, she won't actually begin learning until she attends to what she needs to learn. And that's really gathering the basic information on good leadership practices, key barriers and problems that she might face as a leader, for instance. But really just gathering that information isn't going to get her very far. She has to put it into meaningful context. How does this apply to her work and the challenges she's going to face? This is where she gathers multiple perspectives on effective leadership and really starts to build a mental map or a mental model of the domain. And so far what she's done is really engaged in information processing. She's gathered the information. She's really tried to make sense of that information. But now she's got to apply it. She's got to put those principles into practice. This is where she takes action. And she's going to have to practice time and again and have access to relevant immediate feedback from trusted coaches, from trusted others, of where she can really see what works and what doesn't work, and be able to take the risks to try things, to fail, and to try again. And finally, we found what's so key to learning is to reflect on those patterns, to look back at what worked and didn't work, and figure out, well, why did that work in that situation? And this really starts to happen in communities of experts and communities of practice, of where stories are shared and they really figure out what's working. And so these 5 behaviors are key to learning. Next slide, please. But what happens is that we tend to call all of them learning. We tend to bundle them together. And this isn't a problem if, in fact, when people tend to do one, they tend to do the others. So if taking on the person who takes on the challenge is also more likely to engage in all of the others in this sort of downward spiral effect, then it's fine. We can call them all learning. What motivates one, what's going to drive one, is going to drive the others. Next slide, please. However, if these learning behaviors are independent, if learning is multifaceted, we've got to rethink how we approach learning. If the person who takes on that challenge is no more likely to engage in the behaviors that are actually going to make her learn, we have to think differently about motivating each behavior one at a time. We have to not only motivate learners to take on the challenge, but then once they do, motivate them to focus and really gather that basic information. Motivate them separately to build context. Motivate them separately to repeat practice or reflect. And in addition, if they are independent, different people are going to be driven, being attracted to different behaviors. They're going to like doing some of them and not like others. Next slide, please. And this matters because research has shown that all 5 learning behaviors are needed to learn effectively. So this really wouldn't matter if building a context was enough. You could build context and reflect, you're good to go. But really, we need all 5. So if we're drawn to certain ones and we only engage in certain ones, then really we're not learning as effectively as we can. And if the people that we're coaching just keep tending to do one learning behavior over and over and over again without thinking about the need to do the others, then really, next slide please, we're sabotaging our own learning, and they're sabotaging their own learning. They're thinking about learning as one thing rather than a suite of tools. So if we think about learning as separate things, as separate behaviors, and that individuals are going to prefer engaging in some of these behaviors and avoid others, that's really going to give us a better understanding of their learning processes and a better suite of tools for supporting their learning. Next slide, please. And so really, when I think about this through the viewpoint of assessment, what we want to do, what assessments do is we have behavioral assessments, we have personality assessments, and again, they really set the stage for setting us up for success and self-awareness of what we tend to do, where we tend to get our energy. What my work has done is really look at this through a behavioral perspective of direct observation. So we've gotten to these findings by actually watching adults as they are learning. What do they tend to like doing? What do they tend to avoid doing? And we've really found those individual differences. And so if behavior is a function of personality, environment, and motivation, and we've given the personality piece with the assessment, and we've actually have the behavioral piece through the direct observation, we can now think about what is the environment that's going to motivate these behaviors and have a much clearer perspective on how to help people through their learning processes. Next slide, please. And so really what this means practically, coming from a coaching perspective, is one that we really want to think strategically about what is the learning outcome that we need. So each learning behavior is going to lead to a different learning outcome. If our people, if our leaders really just need to get through a meeting, then really just attending to information is enough. We don't need to incentivize them to apply their knowledge. But if they really need to practice these principles, if they really need to lead, we got to make sure that they're really got the safe spaces for meaningful practice. And really, if they want to achieve that level of expertise, of really that you can achieve over time through critical reflection, then we've really got to think about that as the learning outcome. Because for each learning outcome is going to be a different behavior. And so if we think about what is the learning outcome we need, we think about then what behavior leads to that outcome, we then can think systematically and strategically about how to motivate each behavior and which people are going to be drawn to which behaviors. Finally, this self-awareness that Alan has been talking about of what behaviors I tend to enjoy, what gives me energy. When I'm in crisis, what behaviors do I default to, is going to really help us with our own learning processes and to guide others through theirs. And then in the future, thinking about, and this is where this research might be going, thinking about, well, do populations have certain tendencies? Do medical residents who tend to be really good at memorizing and gathering information, do they tend to resist putting that information into greater context and thinking about it systematically? And so really thinking about what are the ways that we as coaches and as researchers can give insight into individual learning processes through thinking about learning as behavior and different preferences for engaging in these different behaviors. So thank you very much, and I hope that proves useful to you. Turn it back over to, I'm not sure who gets back this time, if it goes to Alan or to Tracy at this point.
Okay. Lisa?
So I do believe we're turning it over to questions, and they're gathering questions.
Yeah.
But it's
Sorry.
Okay, great. No problem.
Yeah, I was on mute. Sorry about that. Okay. Yes, we are starting our question and answer period. Please, everyone, feel free to send me any additional questions that you have via the question button on your GoToWebinar dashboard, or you can send them to me via chat, so I can then read them on to Alan and Michelle. So our first question is, and I guess this goes to either of you, but do you foresee developing selection tools for all specialties so that medical students can better choose a specialty that is aligned to their innate personalities?
So I'll answer that. The answer to that is yes, but that I believe is probably more long-term, just because there's a lot of specialties out there. And so I think what we're going to end up with in the near term is profiles for surgical specialties, medical specialties, and then we'll probably have hybrid profiles for emergency medicine and anesthesiology. But the long-term goal will be to have definitive profiles for each of the specialties, because probably based upon where the person asking the question is going with this is that, at the end of the second year or the beginning of the third year of medical school, people have to decide, am I going to be a pediatrician? Am I going to be a neurosurgeon? And, oftentimes that decision is really the cause of oftentimes a resident not being successful when he or she goes into a certain specialty as one of the causes. But that is something that we're definitely long-term strategically going to be working
on. Okay. All right. Okay, I have another question. This one is for Michelle. For coaching, can you recommend how to identify our coachee's learning style?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's really sort of a preference toward learning behaviors. The way that this research was done is we actually, like I said, directly observed people within a learning session. And I think there might be opportunity as coaches to observe people in training sessions or as they're learning as one way to go. But honestly, more practically based, really having those discussions, understanding the behaviors fundamentally, and having those conversations to say, what do you, and I think probably as you were listening to it, you felt drawn to certain behaviors or others, and starting that conversation to say, what do you think energizes you? And let's put that to the test. Let's think about if we had to ask you to do these things, how does that feel, and actually give them those assignments. So I think the best way and the most practical right now is to have those conversations and to raise that awareness. And if there is the possibility through either mentoring or in training sessions to observe where people tend to have that energy, then that would really give insight.
And I'll add on to what Michelle was saying in terms of just having that awareness. There are assessments that are available that are specifically targeted for learning behavior. One of them is the LSI, or the Learning Style Index from Kolb. Even when we think about the Hogan has the learning approach as one of the scales. So just within that alone, you can determine whether or not someone prefers more academically based learning or whether they're going to be more of a hands-on learner. So there's a lot of different assessments that are available today that are not specifically targeted for this community that can help you as an intermediary step to what Michelle is actually discussing as well in terms of the interviews and the observation.
Okay, great. We have another question. This one is for Alan. Can you tell us how the medical residents have reacted to the assessment process and how the managers responded to giving the feedback?
That's a great question. I think the answer is it depends, and I also think it's a time contextual answer as well. So I think when we first started doing this work, and it was really only for selection, there was a lot of skepticism. There was a lot of concern about amongst the medical students at the time who were applying to become residents because of its use for selection. I will tell you that since then, there's been a lot more acceptance to the process from a selection perspective, but there's been even a greater acceptance by both the resident level folks as well as the program leadership relating to the use of these types of assessments for self-awareness and for their own development. And one of the things that we have done an extensive amount of work with is that I travel around the country and I'll facilitate these group debrief sessions with 30 or 40 residents, and everyone will get there. They'll go through the assessment, whichever assessment we're using, and the day of the session, he or she will get a confidential folder with his or her data in it. I'll facilitate really a group debrief. And the feedback that we've gotten from the surveys has been overwhelmingly positive from both the resident as well as the chair, mentor, program director level. In terms of specifically on the developmental side. And then inevitably what happens is that increases the level of face validity for the selection work, which is partially by design as well.
Okay. All right. I'm going to unmute everyone so that if there are any other questions, we can, everybody can speak freely. Right now, I don't have any additional questions. So, if you don't have a question and you're in a noisy place, please feel free to mute yourself. But everybody is unmute, so if anybody has a question or wants to raise their hand, please let me know. I think we have one more question that I currently have. Hold on one second. And that is, how long until you will have the MD leadership assessment validated for selection to leadership roles? That's for Alan. Alan? Alan, did you hear the question?
Yeah, I heard you. Okay. So sorry about that. Okay. I was muted. So in terms of when we'll have the MD physician leader assessment for selection, that's gonna be a while, just because of the fact that obviously that's a much higher lift in terms of validation studies than to conduct a validation study for developmental purposes. And what I wouldn't want to do is have this be used in a way that potentially could compromise the entire effort, obviously from a legal perspective, but also from an ethical perspective. From the developmental side of things, in terms of the physician leadership assessment, our hope is to have this commercially available at some point in 2017.
Okay, great. All right. If there are no more questions, then I think we may be able to wrap up. Tracy, do you have anything to add, or Tara? Okay.
Oh, can you hear me, Lisa?
Yes, I can.
Well, oh, terrific. Okay, I was muted before. Well, thank you, Alan and Michelle. We really want to thank you for such a comprehensive, thoughtful, and so thank you. My muting, my muting thing just keeps going in and out beyond my control. But I wanted to thank you for a wonderful presentation, and our community of practice for getting together and for joining us, and let these conversations continue.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, guys.
Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.